As Sarah said, I'm the global head of communications and external relations for McKinsey Strategy and Corporate Finance Practice. I'm also a former McKinsey consultant, and I'm based in our Boston office, which is where I'm coming to you from today. Actually, I've led 3 different book campaigns while I've been in this role with the Strategy and Corporate Finance Practice. First one was Strategy Beyond the Hockey Stick in 2018. The second was the 7th edition of our book Valuation in 2020. And then earlier this year, the best-selling CEO Excellence in 2022. So it's really great to be here. Meagan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. Hey, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Meagan Hill. I'm an associate partner at McKinsey. I do almost all of my work in our transformation practice, so working on enterprise-wide change efforts, typically across sectors. I also do a lot of work with Sean and the team in our CEO Excellence service line, which is in the strategy and corporate finance practice. So excited to share with you some of our latest research.
And so we'll be sure to leave some time for Q&A. And also, if folks want to discuss the campaign, we're happy to take questions on that. And we are also pleased to announce that we will be having a drawing for a number of free copies of CEO Excellence for those of you who fill out the survey after the session. So why don't we get started? As this group well knows, and why don't we move to the next page? The CEO role is more important than ever, but it's also more challenging than ever. Fully 2/3 of CEOs said that they felt unprepared when they first entered the role, and less than 1/3 actually don't make it through their first 3 years. And so it's a really, really tough job, but it has huge upside if it's done well. And so our research on the top performing CEOs found a couple really interesting facts if we flip to the transition there. The first one that is really pretty astounding is that if you take the top 200 CEOs that we identified in our research, they drove, and their organizations drove, more than $5 trillion of additional or excess economic value versus their peers. That's the GDP of Japan, right? 200 CEOs. But more importantly, those top quintile CEOs generated 30 times more economic value than the next 3 quintiles of CEOs combined. So there's huge upside to doing this well. And the upside is not just for shareholders. In addition to that massive impact on corporate performance, there's a real human element here. 70 million people report into the largest 2,000 CEOs. 70 million people. And so as we were thinking about this in this broader context, there was a void in research on how CEOs really do this well. And what we found was that there'd been a lot of academic studies that evaluated how they spent their time, for example, but didn't really look comprehensively at the CEO role and then identify what were the best practices within those core aspects of the CEO role that really drove success. And so in order to fill that void, our colleagues, our authors at McKinsey, Carolyn Dewar, Scott Keller, and Vic Malhotra, helped drive a bunch of research that then resulted in what is this book. So maybe we could switch to, as you'll see next, there's some names that you'd recognize pretty quickly here. And what we were trying to do in this research was identify about 200 CEOs that would be the top over the last 2 decades. We started with a list of nearly 8,000 CEOs from the world's 1,000 largest public companies over a 2-decade period. We then looked at the performance of those companies over the 2 decades to identify the real outperformers, right? So we filtered for outsized total returns to shareholders versus their industry peers. We also required that the CEO be in role for at least 6 years. And then we also looked at public recognition as respected leaders. And when we adjusted all that, we also adjusted for CEOs in underrepresented areas such as nonprofits and emerging markets where maybe there were more private companies than public companies. And this brought us to this list of 200 of the highest performing CEOs, the ones that created that $5 trillion of extra economic value over the last 2 decades. And so ultimately, our team interviewed 67 of these folks. They sat down for several hours with each one of them, and they had unfiltered conversations about what the role really entails, how they succeed, and some of their tips and tricks. And so the last thing I'd say before I turn things over to Meagan is that while we might not all be CEOs on the line right now, and we believe that we've really sort of cracked the code on describing how the best CEOs do their job, a lot of what you'll find in this book includes lessons that are relevant for leaders at every level. So let me hand it over to Meagan now to take us through the core of the CEO role.
Great. So what our research showed was what we often refer to as the irreducible core, and it includes these 6 hexagons which have a responsibility within each. And despite our best efforts to get it down to a McKinsey list of 3, we realized that it couldn't really be simplified any further. And so you have at the top left there, set the direction. And within each of these responsibilities, we have 3 practices, which we'll go into more detail shortly. But within set the direction, this is where you have vision, strategy, resource allocation. And then just going down the left-hand side to align the organization, here's where we talk about culture, org design, and talent. Then further down to mobilize through leaders, here's where we think about the top team composition, teamwork, and the operating rhythm. And then up on the top right there with engage the board, here we think about relationships, capabilities, and meetings. With connect with stakeholders, here we looked at social purpose, interactions, and moments of truth or crisis. And then lastly, manage personal effectiveness. Here's where we looked at time and energy, leadership model, and perspective. And what we found, regardless of tenure, was that CEOs that we spoke to spent real time across each of these responsibilities. I think another key insight on this page is the idea that the CEO acts as an ultimate integrator. So being a great CEO doesn't mean that you necessarily have a spike or a strong skill in one of these responsibilities. Being great actually means managing very effectively across all of them. And so if we had to compare this to an Olympic sport, which is a common analogy that we use, this is actually more akin to being a decathlete rather than being a superstar basketball player or soccer player. And what's interesting in our research was that no one else at the company is really playing all of these sports or managing all of these things. And one of the CEOs that we spoke to, Satya Nadella of Microsoft, captured this, I think, really effectively, where he said, part of why the role is so lonely is because there's an information asymmetry problem. No one else really sees what you see from this vantage point. I'll just highlight 3 more things on this framework here. The first is managing paradoxes. And so this framework kind of shows just the complexity of the CEO role. And now layer on top of that, this idea that they're managing paradoxes. So for example, they're trying to balance short-term results versus long-term investment. They're trying to make fact-based decisions while moving fast enough to beat the competition. They're trying to create continuity within the org while also thinking about disrupting the future. So these are all very challenging things to manage in addition to kind of the day-to-day that are captured in this image here. The second point is this idea of transitions to mindset. And so what we found in our research was, and Sean talked a little bit about the conversations that we'd had, but we use this technique in the research called laddering, which is a psychological technique similar to the 5 whys, which means you continue asking why until you get to the root cause. And so in doing this, we not only understood what is the CEO doing, but really the underlying motivation or the why for why they were doing that. And then lastly, as you can imagine, since the book came out, we've been doing many conversations, one-on-ones with CEOs, group sessions. And one of the bits of feedback on this particular page is that this framework really resonates. A lot of the CEOs said that this is very on point. And it wasn't until they saw it that they really realized and had an image to bring to life just the complexity of the role. And here, just quickly, we'll go into each of these mindsets as we go through each responsibility. So I won't, go into detail now, but now we'll just walk through each of the responsibilities. I'll do the first three, and then I'll turn it over to Sean to do the next three. So with set the direction, as mentioned, there's three practices. The mindset here is be bold. And so what we found when we spoke to excellent CEOs is they don't play it safe. Rather, they have this mindset of fortune favors the bold. And that manifests itself differently depending on the practice. So for example, I'll just focus on one of these practices, but in terms of vision, being bold meant reframing the game. And one example that I'll highlight, which I think really captures this, is in our conversations with AJ Bonga, the CEO of MasterCard. He, during his listening tour, when he just stepped into the role, went on a long tour talking to customers, employees. And what he realized was that the company's orientation had been against their competitors. What's Visa doing? What's Amex doing? But during this listening tour, he realized that actually majority of the world's payments are done in cash. And so the real competitor was not these other institutions, it was actually cash. And so he reframed the company's vision to be killing cash. And that really unlocked kind of a new mindset for folks in terms of thinking through what they needed to deliver on strategically. And when we've spoken about this responsibility with CEOs, as I mentioned during our conversations, one of the things that the CEOs share back is, this makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that they worry about is how bold is bold enough? So am I being too bold? Am I not being bold enough? How do I make sure that I'm checking myself? And so what a lot of CEOs do is they form what they call a kitchen cabinet, which is basically an informal network of advisors. And this is one of the things that they'll bring to them on a regular basis and have those folks challenge them and calibrate their thinking.
Meagan, one thing that we might add there on the bold moves, I mentioned earlier the book Strategy Beyond the Hockey Stick, but
Yeah.
again, in a very, very analytical way, we looked at 20 years of data to say what were the big strategic levers that CEOs pulled to actually make bold moves. And what we found was that if you pulled two out of the five bold moves, you had like a 3 times likelier chance of moving to the top quintile. If you pulled 3, you had a 6 times higher chance of moving to the top quintile of performance. So they are knowable and they are pursuable. Some of them are harder than others, but they include, things like programmatic M&A and divestitures, resource reallocation, managing your margins effectively, your investment in R&D. So I'll turn it back to you there. But if folks are interested,
Yeah.
there's a number of articles on how to do that.
That's great. So the next responsibility, align the organization. And so here the mindset is treat the soft stuff like the hard stuff. And so what we found here was that excellent CEOs demand the same rigor and discipline on the people side of the business as they would on, say, your core financial side of the business. And one of the quotes that we use in the book is from Peter Drucker, who says, "What gets measured gets managed, and culture eats strategy for breakfast." And so I think the CEOs that we talked to really embodied these two quotes. And I think I'll highlight again just one of the practices, one of the counterintuitive insights from the practices that you see listed here, and it's with the culture practice. So oftentimes you see leaders have a laundry list of things they need to fix when it comes to the organization's culture. And what we found was that great CEOs actually just distill it down into one thing. And they meticulously obsess and role model and cascade this one thing throughout the organization. And I'll share an example using Satya Nadella again. He aligned the organization around this idea of a growth mindset. And so the goal was really to turn Microsoft from a team of know-it-alls to a team of learn-it-alls to continually foster this innovation culture. And when we spoke to CEOs about this particular responsibility, many CEOs, especially now given the talent environment, emphasize the idea that the soft stuff is, mission critical. And nearly all of them had, talent and culture in their top, 3 to 5 priorities. And so I think in this environment in particular, we've spent a lot of time talking about, how do you make sure that you're really doing and spending the right amount of time on this responsibility. The next responsibility, so mobilize through leaders. Here, the mindset is solve for the team psychology. And so what we saw excellent CEOs do here is they prioritize the dynamics over the mechanics. And there's one quote I'll share from one of the CEOs that we interviewed from DSM, and he said, "What makes the team successful isn't just the players or the process, it's the way that they deal with each other. After all, the bricks are useless without the cement." And so many CEOs, how they embodied this concept is they talked about the importance of getting the team to solve for the whole versus optimizing for their part of the organization. So really shifting the mindset from, I care only about my area of the business to how do I make sure that we all kind of grow and prosper together. And there were different ways that they did this via, slogans within the organization, via organizing their team meetings to make sure that this was a principle that they carried out in practice. And when we spoke to CEOs about this particular responsibility, many said that they were, quite familiar with making sure that they had the right environment set up for talent to prosper. One of the things that CEOs said was their top regret when it came to talent was just not acting fast enough. And so often, there were talent decisions that they should have made early in their tenure, and they decided to give that individual, more of a chance, and it turned out to be not the best decision. And so with that, Sean, I'll turn it over to you to cover the 3 remaining responsibilities.
Awesome. So the next one is around engaging the board, and all CEOs have to do this. And the mindset is this notion of helping the directors help the business. In the research, and I'd imagine some of you have the same experience, many CEOs may try to manage their board or keep them at arm's distance. But the excellent CEOs that we spoke to who contributed to the book really took a very different approach. They looked at the board as a low-cost, highly skilled set of consultants who could help them, and they were very, very intentional about building trust and radical transparency with their board, working with the chair to help shape the boards and evolve the board's composition. They invested in board relationships and education. And Piyush Gupta, who led a struggling bank actually in Singapore, now a big bank, and to turn it into a tech company that also happened to do banking, really needed to get his board aligned with that. So he actually took them to South Korea to visit tech companies and to visit other banks that were doing innovative things with technology. So, there's some other interesting figures there. Fully 4/5 of executives think at least one of their board members needs to be replaced. So actively thinking about how are you building this group of directors who are going to help the business, and that the boards of the excellent CEOs actually found that 17% more time was spent on strategic review and 50% less time on compliance related issues, right? So the board really is engaging on strategy. In our conversations about the book, new CEOs have often pushed back pretty hard on this premise of radical transparency and really openly engaging with the board. But the experienced ones are almost always nodding their heads when our authors and others share this with CEOs and talk about building transparency and trust. And the high-performing CEOs were unanimous on the importance of this point. And then as you'll see on the next one, and I'd imagine many folks in the audience are thinking about stakeholders. As you think about how do you connect with stakeholders as that key part of the CEO's role, the mindset is this notion of starting with the why. And the really great CEOs, the excellent CEOs that we spoke to, really tried to understand not just their own company's purpose, but also their stakeholders' purpose and motivations. And that included how they dealt with the press. For example, Reed Hastings of Netflix, he believed that reporters wanted to be truth tellers, but he also recognized that oftentimes they're forced to be entertainers. And what he tried to do was give them both so that he could still get his desired message across. And this notion of a baseline bar for living your organizational purpose keeps rising, and many of the CEOs talked about that. And as one of them put it, Doug Baker, you can't get trapped in a life where you do evil during the day and then do good from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. to try to offset it. They really came together on this, the importance of marrying your purpose and your core operations so that winning in one meant winning in another. And this is the element of the role that many of the CEOs we've been meeting with have been most nervous about, because now they're being asked by their organizations and by external stakeholders to engage on issues that prior generations of executives would have completely sidestepped. And so this is something that is obviously evolving, but this notion of thinking through where and when do you take a public stance, very few CEOs have done that, and more are now thinking about it. And then, as you'll see on the final, this is more around personal effectiveness and managing personal effectiveness. The big mindset there is on focusing on what only you can do. The excellent CEOs really aggressively avoid the trap of doing whatever needs to be done and really focus on what only they can do. And paradoxically, and this was another interesting finding from the discussions and the research, they don't follow the mantra of it's a marathon, not a sprint, but instead they sort of treat the role of CEO as a series of sprints. You're driving hard for intense periods, but then you build in flexibility and recovery time so that you can engage in the next sprint. Another theme that came out on this was this notion of, living your to-be list. And the to-be list is, it's not just about what do you want to accomplish, but it's also how do you want to show up? And then what steps will you take to stay humble? So another one of our CEOs, the former CEO of Discount Bank, would continually remind herself that, people would walk in and talk to the chair that she was sitting in because she was in the CEO's role. And she would remind herself that they're talking to the person in the chair. And today I'm in the chair and that makes me powerful, but tomorrow I won't be in it. And to really be able to sort of step outside yourself and recognize that it's not about you individually as a person as much as it is about the role that you're stewarding in the organization. And this is a topic that was evergreen, and the reactions, every CEO that we've spoken to has wanted to dig in more on that. And I think one last thing that's important to mention that came through in the research is that all of the CEOs and a number of the ones that we had these conversations with were former CEOs who had been very successful, is that the excellent CEOs focused on both starting and finishing strong. The high-performing ones often started with a listening tour, and they took a really brutally honest look at the current state of their organization. And then, as Meagan pointed out earlier, they really focused on one thing and they conveyed a direction with great simplicity. And then they used a litmus test to ensure that they didn't overstay their tenure. And that included both personal motivations. Am I still finding joy in the role? Do I still feel challenged? Have my personal circumstances changed? But also external situations like, has the industry changed? Am I still the right person for this role? And then on the back end, those high-performing CEOs really ensured that they had a great succession plan with a number of strong internal candidates. And then when it was time for them to move, they would orchestrate a really seamless transition to ensure that, the performance legacy that they had put in place would continue. So, we hope you found these insights helpful. I've seen that there are some questions that are coming in through the chat, and maybe we'll turn it back to Sarah to fire some of those up. And again, we're also happy to talk about the experience of literally running the campaign for the book across social media and others. So whatever you're all interested in, we're here for you.
Yeah, definitely. So we have a question from one of our trustees named Treaty. She said, are there any suggestions on how to form the kitchen cabinet inside the organization versus outside the organization, familiar with person or new, so can give new perspectives?
Do you want to take it first, Megan? You want me to?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Okay.
So I think what we saw with the excellent CEOs is oftentimes they would look outside the organization, just because they're typically sharing things that are that could be a bit sensitive to share with peers and others within their organization. And so common individuals that would be on a kitchen cabinet would include mentors of any sort. So academic advisors, folks that they've worked with in the past from a similar or different industry, lifelong friends. I think what we saw was when the kitchen cabinet is constructed effectively, it really has a diverse range of personalities, knowledge, capabilities, because then as the CEO, you're really getting a broad set of inputs and insights.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add is spouses also came up in terms of the kitchen cabinet, and that notion of really having a diverse group and having trust-based relationships was very, very important. Excuse me.
Awesome, thank you. So we have another question. I work at an organization with multiple CEOs, market versus headquarters, and I work in a role where I advise a market CEO. How do I maintain professionalism and positivity when a recommendation that is best for market staff is not taken by the HQ CEO?
So just to make sure, I'm going to try and restate the question to make sure. So this is someone who works in a sort of BU divisional structure where there's a group CEO and then there are divisional CEOs. And the question is, what do you do when the divisional CEO has a recommendation or a specific strategy they want to pursue, yet the group CEO doesn't follow it? I think one of the things that we did talk about in the book, this notion of solving for the psychology of the team. One of the challenges that group CEOs have, and this is spoken, we speak to this in CEO excellence, but also in strategy beyond the hockey stick, is this notion of resource reallocation. And it is a challenge. And sometimes what you'll find is a divisional CEO may say, I've got this amazing opportunity and we should really pursue it. And if the group CEO isn't willing to reallocate resources to fund that and to make a big bet, you end up not getting that outsized performance. So one answer would be that we could send you a copy of Strategy Beyond the Hockey Stick, but in sort of more immediate terms, this notion of being able to show the outsized impact that particular strategy can drive. And then we found that the successful CEOs would often set aside 5-10% funds across all the divisions. So everybody would get 5% less resource, but then that would be the sort of big bets pool, so that a divisional CEO can come to the group CEO and say, I need to make this big bet, and I think that this is the one that's going to be the most successful and carry the company. Megan, anything you'd add on that one?
No, I think you captured it.
Oh, awesome. We have one from Kevin Pet Show. So Sean and Megan, 30% of CEOs lasting less than 3 years in their jobs, and 2 out of 5 CEOs are perceived to be failing within 18 months. Presents opportunities and challenges for us as corporate communications or public relation leaders. So what are 1 or 2 best practices that you recommend that we adhere to when trying to work with a new CEO to help them succeed in their role?
I think, Sean, with the communications angle, that might be a question for you.
Well, absolutely, the tenures are short and seem to be getting shorter. The whole notion of the fifth mindset around engaging with stakeholders is an important one where communications professionals can play a significant role. And it is especially important in the instances where the executive has had a shorter tenure. So helping them understand, the broader arc of the history of the company and the company's place within sort of the stakeholder ecosystem are both things that can be very helpful. I've also seen a couple other questions that are coming into the everyone chat, and I think I'll stop there. But I would say that from a communications perspective, providing that background and that context, and then perhaps if it's a new CEO, accompanying them on the listening tour to make sure that that one big thing that the CEO is going to pursue is very quickly and very effectively communicated within the organization, because that is how you start to turn that big boat and make those big bets, the being bold. Meagan, anything you'd add there?
No, I think that's great.
Okay, cool. There was a question that I see that was shared with everybody about hospital or health system CEOs. Absolutely. But the research was conducted principally in the sort of the beginnings of the pandemic, and we did not have an opportunity to fully incorporate the impact of COVID-19 on hospital executives. But we are doing some continuing research, and there's more to come on that one.
Oh, that's exciting. Yeah, that'd definitely be a book in itself, just see. I saw one question that I thought was great. What do leading CEOs say they regret the most, Sean and Megan?
We've got an answer
saw
for
that
that.
one.
Meagan, you look like
Yeah.
you're ready to take it.
Yes,
No, I saw that one too, because we get this one a lot. Or like another common question is, was there anything the excellent CEOs weren't great at, or did we ask them like about their failures or their setbacks? So we didn't, in the interviews, we didn't really ask questions about failures or setbacks, but I did highlight the thing that most frequently came up in terms of regret, and it was the not moving fast enough on talent. So oftentimes when they had just stepped into the role as a new CEO and they were evaluating their executive team, they had thought, I'll give this individual a bit more time, but then in hindsight, many months into the role, reevaluated and said they should have made a decision faster.
Yeah, and building on that, Meagan alluded earlier to this notion of solving for the team psychology. And you may have an absolutely amazing bench of star players, but if they are not playing together as a team, you are not going to get nearly, and this was a very, very common theme that we heard from the excellent CEOs. And one of the examples that is detailed in the book is Phil Jackson, who coached the Dream Team. I think it was the night, I can't remember which year of the Olympics it was, but they literally had every all-star NBA player, but initially they really weren't playing well as a team because they hadn't played on a team together before. And one of the things that Phil did was he had them play with a bunch of very competitive college students who were a team, and he let them lose. And so this dream team was like, they really had to think hard about how were they operating as a team as opposed to just a collection of all-stars. And that's sort of another thing that you've got to move pretty quickly on when it comes to talent. And then the last point is, one of the things that we do at McKinsey is we can help our clients do this thing called mapping talent to value. And maybe Meagan, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, and that reminds me, I had seen a question about what does it mean by don't put people first. So that was one of the in one of our responsibilities. I think it's in the Mobilize Through Leaders one, or it's in the Align the Organization. One of the kind of the ways that you carry out the mindset for talent is don't put people first. And the thinking there is that you should identify your most high impact roles within the organization. And once you have an understanding of that, like the highest revenue generating roles, then you align your top talent to make sure that you've got the most capable people within those roles. So it's not, don't put the individual first, it's put the role and the requirements of that role first. And so we do this type of work at McKinsey where we'll take a look at the organization, map out where those highest impact roles are, and then we'll help you think through, do you have the right people in those places given required skill sets and capabilities.
And sometimes they might be 3 levels down from the CEO, but they're driving massive impact, right? And so how do you raise the profile of those roles and really attract like the key talent that can help drive that, that impact, that value creation? And sometimes the results are very unintuitive or counterintuitive. And so, yeah, thank you.
That was great. Do we have time for a few more questions?
Sure.
Yeah.
So there's one about social issues, which is a huge thing for us in the communications industry. So you mentioned that more CEOs are thinking about the pressures to take a stand on social issues. What were some of the barriers, real or perceived, to speaking out for these high-performing CEOs? Were there any surprises? Were they same as, like, did they have similarities amongst each other?
Yeah, so a good example that came up in the book was the CEO of a company, an energy and materials company called NESTE, and Greenpeace was protesting outside their annual meeting, and they were getting a bit of attention. And the CEO, rather than trying to ignore it, actually invited them in to the building to talk and really talk, and then had an extended and candid conversation on renewable raw materials, right? And so the idea was that they were engaging rather than just trying to keep them at arm's length. And it turned out that then, that sort of helped significantly mitigate the level of protest because they were actually engaging on the topic. And so, to your question, Sarah, one of the things is you don't have to necessarily put out an opinion piece every time. Sometimes it's just enough to listen and sort of and coming back to that, start with the why, really understand what their why is. And then is there something that you can sort of solve for where it works for your organization and it works for them?
That's great. Awesome. So we just had a question for Michael. The recent Edelman Trust Barometer update on trust in the workplace said employees are looking to CEOs to take positions on social issues of concern to employees. How are you seeing excellent CEOs dealing with the internal pressure, like of internal communication?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, coming back to each CEO's context is going to be different. The research on the book was conducted prior to a lot of this really rising, right? And so in our experience, we have some examples that were more about catastrophes that happened with an organization and where the organization had to address it head on. One example was Mary Barra, the CEO of GM, and many of you may recall the ignition switch recall, right? They had some problems with ignition switches. It led to some really nasty accidents. Some people died, right? And it turned out that some folks at GM had actually, to varying degrees, they basically just said, look, here's what happened. We shouldn't have done it this way. This is how we're going to do it going forward. We're really sorry, and we want to do the right thing. And so part of it is just sort of recognizing and owning something that may have happened in the past. And this notion of how do you stay elevated in a crisis? And so there are crises that are very unique to a company, and then there are crises that can be more societal. And I think the point around, organizations asking their CEOs to take a stand is absolutely rising. We didn't, and I don't know if Meagan, you've got any other examples there of where, the CEO took a more public stand on a an issue of public concern versus one that was specific to the company.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add is just from our experience with executive development programs, we have a couple of programs at the firm that we run with an academic institution. And so we'll have, CFOs and CEOs come and participate on campus. And I think the most liveliest discussions are around, what do you do around ESG, or what do you do if there's like a crisis situation? And what you'll see in these discussions is that like no one really has it, figured out. Everybody's kind of sharing with each other. They're making their own judgment calls. And so I would say like the way to do this, continues to evolve just because it's so new.
Yeah, and a couple other stats that might be worthwhile sharing. One is that nearly 60% of our top CEOs, of our excellent CEOs, considered external affairs a top priority. So you can take that back to your CEOs. But only 12% of them self-identified as being successful. So there's a huge untapped opportunity for us all as professionals to help our leaders on this. And the context is changing, and CEOs are expected to be a little bit more public. And this notion of tying one's purpose, CEOs are absolutely expected to speak more about, at least at a minimum, what is their corporate purpose, and how does that tie to their approach to serving the marketplace, to engaging employees. And as Meagan mentioned, many companies now are getting much more holistic about reporting on ESG. And that also is helping drive these discussions, because if you're in a glass house, you don't want to throw stones. So first things first, many of these CEOs are getting their own organizations connected to their purpose before they take a public stand, right? So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, that's definitely helpful. Would you want to take one more question and maybe talk about the book campaign a little bit? Would that work, Sean?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So we have a question from a University of Florida professor named Rita Men. She said, how much does the excellence of CEOs recognize the value of communications or public relations for their organization? Did any of the CEOs talk about cultivating the company's culture? So kind of in line what we.
Yeah, so that 60% stat, considering external affairs to be a top priority and engaging with external stakeholders to be a top priority is definitely in there. And this notion of culture, I think, does come back to the points that Meagan was talking about earlier, and the mindsets around aligning the organization. So absolutely, that is in there.
Awesome, thanks.
Sure.
Do you want to share a little bit about the marketing campaign for the book as well, or?
Well, so hopefully some of you at least have heard of it beyond today's session. It was more, we're happy to respond to any questions that came up. This was we were really full bore for about 6 months. There was a large pre-order campaign. A lot of the, things like, the Be Bold mindset was one that McKinsey had already done very significant research on. So the other thing that we tried to do was to tie this to, other areas of research that we'd already done and serve as teasers. We've got a board excellence practice as well. So some of the sort of board best practices could then tie to CEO excellence. So if there are any specific questions that folks have, we're happy to field them. But, we were very pleased to see this was the first sort of very, very broad book from the firm that just the groundswell of positive reaction was astounding. And our external marketing team that we worked with said that we have, if you go onto Amazon, we have far and away, I think we're over 500 reviews, which is actually quite uncommon for, a business book of this kind. So we've been really pleased with the way we've been able to start dialogues on social media, for example. And we also found that having these 67 CEOs was a huge help, because a number of them were more than happy to talk further about the points that they'd shared, because they see their legacy as helping, people in the future also be successful. And so they were fantastic partners in terms of sharing the word.
Awesome. That's wonderful. And I know that there's like a plethora of resources on the book's website and a bunch of videos and podcasts for people.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk if you go to McKinsey.com/CEO excellence, I think even just CEO, you should find the the landing page that includes a whole bunch of videos, some really inspiring videos that we did with the authors, not just on their work serving clients, but also their personal lives. One of our very, very touching videos that you might not otherwise expect. We've done a number of podcasts that have gotten fantastic traction, and we are now launching a Voices on CEO Excellence podcast series to go along with our Inside the Strategy Room podcast, which you can find at mckinsey.com/ITSR. So if you'd like to hear more about this from the people who wrote the book, we've got, I think, 4 or 5 podcasts on the topic now. So.
Okay, awesome. And are there any final thoughts that you guys want to share?
I mean, I would just say Sarah, thank you so much and Tina, thank you so much for having us speak today. Really, really thrilled to be here. Would love feedback. My email address is SEAN_Brown, BROWN @mckinsey.com. Happy to take further questions. And as I said at the beginning, we're also happy to share some copies of the book. So Sarah and her team are going to be sending out a survey, and that'll be your opportunity to request a copy. And depending on how many requests we get, either we'll give them to everybody, or it might end up being a lottery or a drawing. But we are going to give out a number of books. So thank you. Megan?
Yeah, I just echo the thanks. Great to be here. Sarah, Tina, team, really appreciate it. And I hope everyone enjoys the book.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for being here. And
awesome.
Yeah.
And to quote Bill and Ted, be excellent, everyone.
And follow
All right.
to everybody that's registered with the links and more information for a book. So if they want to read more. Awesome. Thank you all so much.
Great.
Everyone.
Thanks.